I suppose this would be one of our all things considered broadcasts or commentaries. I'll probably enlarge this one a little because it will have to do with the new book that I'm writing. When I look at the questions about what's moral and what's not moral and what's ethical and what's not ethical, one realizes that essentially there's sometimes a conflict between the ethical and the moral, and sometimes a conflict between concepts of the ethical, the moral, and the law. I don't want to discuss those particular conflicts right now, or the difference between ethics and morality. I think I don't think there's much question, but that there is a biological basis of morality. Ethics would seem to be more cultural, and certainly differ from one culture to another. But when we look at the philosophical propositions that come before us in these questions, one that particularly I find a little bit lacking, I think, somehow. Philosophers and ethicists like to pose this question among others. Supposing you see a trolley racing down a track, and there are 5 people in the way of the trolley who will be killed by it. Now, in one version of this conundrum, you have the option of pulling a switch, and the trolley will then go on a different track and kill only 1 person instead of 5. However, and even with that one, this question arises. On the other conundrum is the trolley's racing down, which will kill 5 people. There's a very heavy-set person on a bridge above the trolley track. Now, if he's big enough that he would actually stop the trolley, but he would be killed. Is it moral to push him over so he's killed in order to save the 5? The question that has, to my knowledge, never been asked when you're told to contemplate this and choose which action you think would be morally acceptable. They never ask you, in your reasoning, do you stop to think, if I push the fat man over and he stops the trolley but gets killed, of course I'll be charged with homicide. If I allow the 5 people to get killed by the trolley, then that's just an accident. But pushing the fat man over and killing him is not an accident. It's an intentional act, and therefore you're guilty of homicide. Even if you pulled the switch and killed the 1 man, there's still a question. Because the 5 people would have been killed accidentally, the 1 man would have been killed because you took an action. And therefore, what's your legal responsibility? And that would have to figure, of course, if you took a gut reaction, instant reaction without thinking, you might do who knows what. But if you thought about it even for a couple of seconds, the fact that you'd be murdering somebody because you took an action that resulted in somebody's death in the one case, and you actually pushed a person to their death in the other, which is a clear case of homicide. So you have to allow the 5 people to get killed. Well, that's the conundrum that's placed. But the question about legal responsibility never comes up when they're asking it. And yet, surely many people who think about it would think about this as an act of homicide for which you could then get life in prison or whatever. You'd probably not get the death penalty, but you'd get life in prison. So this is one of the questions that's never asked. The other question that comes to my mind, I want to say this as a preface to a series, because this is actually my blog as well. And the All Things Considered things are really my blog, audio blog. We so often hear people talking about demonic possession when people do certain things or act in certain ways, have certain mental illnesses. And that can be quite dangerous also. But what happens when there's damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex in a person's brain, and they're no longer able to have emotional responses. Some of the things they could and might do under those circumstances could be seen as symptoms of psychopathy because the emotional part is missing. They, for instance, could push the person off the bridge in front of the trolley and feel no particular emotion about it at all. On the other hand, they likely wouldn't do it anyway because they wouldn't feel any particular emotion about the 5 people who are going to be killed. And we could, now, could somebody say that a sudden personality change in a person has sustained some damage to the this area of the brain, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, could or other segments of the brain that might deprive a person of their emotional responses. They have a sudden change in personality. So how would we interpret that? Supposing this came up in confession or the spouse's confession about this incredible change in a person. And we could say they've been possessed by demons, they've become evil, they've sold their soul, or they're developing a tumor in this portion of the brain. Any sudden, even if it takes place over a year, dramatic change in personal attitudes and behavior and personality like that should be referred to medical doctors. And no priest is competent to take a decision about it himself. No priest is competent to take a decision about that himself. It has to go, for example, if a priest were trained in psychology, he might look at it from a psychological point of view, but he isn't capable of diagnosing a tumor in the brain. That would have to be on the some doctor would have to refer someone to a brain scan or something like that. But there are these situations which can develop in which we might think that there's a moral issue, when it's not a moral issue. It's actually an issue of a physical illness. Now you see the damage to the ventral medial prefrontal cortex or any place in the brain, if it's a tumor or concussion, a heavy blow to the brain, is a medical problem, even though the end result might be symptoms of some moral problem, or that we would judge as a moral problem. If we leave it at that level, we might be responsible for somebody's death because they don't get a diagnosis of something that might be treated, otherwise might kill them. So there's an issue here. An action might be immoral according to one or another moral code, a moral system, but it might not be caused by any kind of immorality on the part of the person who's carried out this act. It might be something quite different. And we have to be extremely cautious about our judgments in these cases. The thing is that there's always a difference in the actions that we do take, like the conundrum I described before. There's kind of a war in our minds about moral issues. Sometimes that battle takes place because we're faced with an issue that deals with commonweal, the greater good, or the individual. And this is part of the conundrum that I mentioned earlier about the trolley. It's phrased in dozens of different ways, but that is one of the particular conundrums. What sacrifice is necessary for the greater good, and does that actually constitute a sense of commonweal, or is it simply John Stuart Mills opposed to Immanuel Kant or something like that? This is part of the thing we face in discussing morality and ethics, but we also have to take into account civil law, which sometimes isn't taken into account. And now let's take an example that, from our point of view, abortion is generally immoral. Civil law, however, doesn't agree. Civil law permits it. What is the boundary that we must not cross in trying to advocate for our moral concept, in this case as opposed to civil law? And in these situations which have held up, for example, even our conservative government, which is very conservative, the government of Canada at this moment, is not going to raise the issue of abortion. It's been settled in Canada. It's been settled for many decades. And there are certain constitutional and charter guarantees. This government, as conservative as it is, does not want to open this question back up because they know that a substantial majority of Canadians are perfectly comfortable with the law the way it is, and that it's only particularly religious people who really have moral questions about abortion. Now, I have met atheists who also question the morality of abortion. So, you know, it's not a cut and dry thing that this is a strictly religious concept. But since it's primarily driven by our religious sensitivities, where is the boundary that we must not cross? Where would we begin to do something immoral ourselves in order to try to express our moral beliefs and try to have the law changed? There has to be some kind of a boundary here. For one thing, in a democratic society, the will of the majority is most of the time going to prevail. I can't say it always prevails because in both the American Congressional Center and the Canadian system and the Canadian parliamentary system, you can never say that any one party expresses the will of the majority of Americans or Canadians. Even when you have a majority government, such as we do in Canada at this time, conservative majority in Parliament, therefore they form the government. You know, we don't elect a prime minister in Canada, we elect a parliament. Whichever party gets the most seats in Parliament is invited by Her Majesty's representative to form a government. And the prime minister then becomes the head of government. Not the head of state, but the head of government. So the conservative majority does not represent a majority of the Canadian people, because the opposition parties in Parliament also have a substantial number of seats. In fact, Her Majesty's loyal opposition, the New Democratic Party, has 103 seats in a Parliament of 210 seats. The other opposition parties have also seats in Parliament. And they represent sometimes constituencies or ridings, as we call them, that are much larger than some of the ridings in population, much larger than some of the ridings that the government represents. Consequently, we cannot say that the government represents a majority of the Canadian people. Nor can you say it in Canada, in the United States either. Somebody who represents a riding or constituency takes a substantial portion of Los Angeles or New York, certainly offsets any majority that someone who represents a small constituency in North Carolina represents, or New Jersey, or wherever. Consequently, we don't always have majority rule, but the majority of the people in both the United States and Canada are satisfied with the abortion laws the way they are now. So, in a democratic society, what are the boundaries that we have to draw in what kinds of action we take in expressing our moral revulsion at abortion. It's one of those conflicts that often isn't taken into account, and that is this action moral or this action moral? And we have to ask, what does civil law say? It's not just what our religion says. It's what civil law says also in a democratic society. In any society, particularly a theocratic society such as Iran, because it's theocratic and because it's absolute and because it's an absolute control, a lot of things that we consider morally repulsive, morally degrading, morally wrong, morally evil, take place. And they would take place in every theocratic society, just as they would take place in a communist society, because communist society is about the same level as a theocratic society. So when we're looking at moral, immoral, ethical and non-ethical, and I'm going to discuss this a little bit in this All Things Considered, so if you're not interested, particularly in the subject, then don't bother with the All Things Considered. You know, when you see me sitting in my print shop speaking, don't bother with those if you're not particularly interested in this question. You can simply skip those broadcasts. But it is an interesting question, and I would really like to have some feedback from you. The question that comes up among school kids very often, and here's an interesting thing about the younger generation, which do not buy into our prejudices and malices and hatreds, is because they've been planetized. That is, they have a consciousness of the entire planet in a way that older generations don't. They have a consciousness of the greater community of mankind that older generations don't. Consequently, the more conservative people are politically, the less of a consciousness they have of the greater whole. Younger generation people tend to have a greater sense of the whole. And they reason in ways that another generation doesn't reason. And that, of course, is partly because of changes in education, but also in changes in communications and how one communicates, how we do communicate instantly around the world and all this. It has to do with things like the fact that we can be grief-stricken over one person who dies, even if we didn't know them, we can feel grief. But we have less of an emotional reaction if 1 million people get killed. You know, it's one of Stalin's famous aphorisms: the death of one person is a tragedy, the death of 1 million people is a statistic. He might not have been saying that with some kind of evil or malicious intent, but simply as an observation. If he kills one person, it's noticed. If 1 million people die in a war or some other process, then they're statistics. They're not really tragedies anymore. That's part of the way our human mind is limited in its reasoning powers. So I wanted to open up this discussion, and I'll proceed on it a little further, that to what intent, to what degree is there a conflict between ethics and morality and law? And to how does this affect the differences in different generations and different ways of thinking? Say, the Immanuel Kant and the John Stuart Mill's way of thinking, the conservative, the liberal, median way of thinking and approaching different problems in society and moral and ethical problems. So we'll carry this discussion on more and more a little later. But in the meantime, I see that I've gone to 16 minutes, and that's probably about as long as any broadcast should be. So we'll take this up later, and I'll hope to hear your input and your questions and suggestions as well. Thank you, and God bless you.